Go ahead, my daughter-in-law said with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. There's really nothing left for Helen to decide. Everyone at the conference table smiled after that. My son smiled. The attorney's assistant smiled politely. Even Brooke looked relaxed, like someone who had already crossed the finish line. They all believed this meeting was a formality. They all believed the outcome had already been decided. What none of them knew was that my late husband had spent the final months of his life preparing for this exact moment. And before that meeting ended, every smile in that room would disappear. I sat quietly at the far end of the polished walnut conference table inside Whitaker & Associates, a law firm located in downtown Columbus, Ohio. The office overlooked the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Sunlight reflected off the glass buildings outside, casting bright patterns across the room. It should have felt warm. Instead, the air felt strangely cold. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and listened as everyone else discussed my future as though I weren't sitting 3 feet away from them. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 71 years old. 6 months earlier, I lost my husband, Richard, after 43 years of marriage. Richard had been my best friend since I was 26 years old. We built a life together, raised a son together, and spent decades believing that family meant loyalty. After he passed away, I discovered that grief wasn't the hardest thing to survive. Betrayal was. The maintenance costs alone are becoming unreasonable, Brooke said smoothly. She glanced toward Ethan before turning back to the attorney. Helen deserves a simpler life. Somewhere she can relax and be taken care of. I noticed how carefully she chose her words. Everything sounded thoughtful, compassionate, reasonable. That was Brooke's gift. She could make almost anything sound generous. Ethan nodded immediately. We're only thinking about what's best for Mom. Mom. He hadn't called me that much lately unless other people were watching. I looked at my son across the table. Ethan was 42 now. Successful. Intelligent. Confident. Richard used to say Ethan had a good heart. I used to believe that too. Maybe part of me still wanted to. But over the past several months, something had changed. Every conversation felt managed. Every visit felt scheduled. Every decision somehow passed through Brooke first. The house is simply too much responsibility, Brooke continued. A senior living community would provide activities, support, and peace of mind. She smiled again. That same perfect smile. The one she wore whenever she wanted something. The attorney, James Whitaker, adjusted his glasses while reviewing several documents. He remained professional and unreadable. I appreciated that. Unlike everyone else in the room, he wasn't pretending this meeting was about feelings. It was about paperwork. It was about ownership. It was about control. Outside, traffic moved steadily through the afternoon streets below. Inside, the conversation continued without me. I listened as they discussed my home. The home Richard and I bought 37 years ago. The home where Ethan learned to ride a bicycle. The home where every Christmas morning, every birthday dinner, every family photograph had been taken. To them, it was an asset, a property, a number on a page. To me, it was a life. Of course, Brooke said, leaning forward slightly. Helen would still have access to everything she needs. I almost smiled at that. Access. Such an interesting word. You only talk about access when something belongs to someone else. Ethan finally looked toward me. Don't worry, Mom. We'll make sure you're comfortable. Comfortable. Another interesting word. Nobody had asked whether I wanted to leave my home. Nobody had asked what Richard wanted. Nobody had asked what promises had been made before he died. They simply assumed the answers no longer mattered. I kept my expression calm. That seemed to encourage them. The quieter I became, the more confident they grew. Brooke crossed one leg over the other and exchanged a glance with Ethan. The kind of glance shared by people who think they've already won. I think we're all in agreement, Brooke said. There's really no reason to delay moving forward. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then James Whitaker closed one folder and reached toward another. His expression changed slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. But I noticed. Richard always said I paid attention to details. Actually, James said carefully, before we proceed, there is one final item we need to address. Brooke's smile remained in place. Ethan looked unconcerned. Neither of them seemed worried. Why would they be? They thought they knew every document that existed. They thought they understood every decision Richard had made. They thought this meeting belonged to them. James placed a sealed envelope on the table. My heart beat once, hard enough that I could feel it in my chest. I recognized the handwriting immediately, even from across the room. Richard Carter. My husband's name written in dark blue ink. James rested his hand lightly on top of the envelope. This, he said, was delivered under very specific instructions. For the first time that afternoon, Brooke's smile faltered. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The conference room seemed to shrink around that sealed envelope sitting in the center of the table. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. James Whittaker looked down at the envelope before lifting his eyes toward me. Something in his expression reminded me of Richard. Not because they looked alike. They did not. It was the seriousness. The understanding that some moments carry more weight than others. Brooke was the first to recover. She laughed softly and leaned back in her chair. "I am sure it is just a personal letter," she said. "Richard was always sentimental." Ethan nodded. "Dad liked leaving notes." I watched them carefully. Their confidence had returned almost instantly. The brief crack in Brooke's composure had disappeared. She folded her hands neatly on the table and offered another polished smile. To anyone else, she would have looked calm. But after 14 years of watching her, I noticed the details. The slight tension around her eyes. The way her fingers tapped once against the armrest. The way she kept glancing at the envelope. James cleared his throat. "This document was delivered to my office 3 weeks before Richard passed away." Brooke's smile faded slightly. "And?" she asked. "And Richard gave very specific instructions regarding when it could be opened." Ethan shifted in his seat. "What kind of instructions?" James opened a folder and reviewed a page. He instructed that it could only be presented during a meeting involving the disposition of Helen Carter's residence or any discussion regarding her relocation from that residence. The room became very still. I saw Ethan blink. Once. Slowly. Brooke turned toward him. "That is oddly specific." James simply nodded. "Yes, it is." My heart tightened. I remembered those final months with Richard. The long afternoons on our back porch. The cups of coffee growing cold between us while autumn leaves drifted across the yard. At the time, I thought he was simply reflecting on life. Looking back now, I realized he had been preparing, planning, protecting. The realization filled me with both comfort and sadness. Richard knew something I did not. Somehow, he had seen what was coming. "Before we continue," James said, "I would like to confirm that everyone understands the purpose of today's meeting." Brooke answered immediately. "Of course. We are discussing the transition plan for Helen and the future management of the property." Transition plan. Such gentle words. As though they were discussing a vacation instead of uprooting someone's life. James wrote something on a legal pad. "Very well." Ethan finally looked directly at me. "Mom, nobody is trying to force you into anything." I met his eyes calmly. "Then why does it feel like every decision has already been made?" His mouth opened slightly before closing again. Brooke answered for him. "Because we are trying to help." Help. Over the past 6 months I had heard that word dozens of times. Every time a boundary was crossed. Every time a decision was made without me. Every time someone treated me like I could no longer manage my own life. It was always called help. I did not argue. I simply folded my hands again and waited. That seemed to frustrate Brooke more than any confrontation could have. She preferred reactions. She preferred emotional responses she could dismiss as grief or confusion. Silence gave her nothing to work with. James reached for the envelope. "Before this document is opened, there is one additional fact that should be entered into the record." Brooke straightened immediately. Ethan frowned. "What fact?" James adjusted his glasses. Richard Carter personally updated his estate instructions 48 days before his passing. The color drained slightly from Ethan's face. 48 days? He repeated. "I never heard anything about that." "Very few people did," James replied. Brooke forced a smile. "Well, I am sure there is a reasonable explanation." James looked directly at her. "There is." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. I could almost feel the tension spreading across the table. Brooke crossed her arms. Ethan stared at the envelope. For the first time all afternoon, neither of them looked certain. And sitting there quietly, I found myself remembering something Richard had said only a week before he died. We had been watching the sunset through our kitchen window. The sky had turned shades of orange and gold. He reached over and squeezed my hand. "Promise me something, Helen." "Anything," I had told him. He smiled softly. "When the time comes, do not defend yourself. Just wait." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief, about the difficult months ahead. Now, as James Whittaker carefully broke the seal on that envelope, I finally understood what Richard meant. And judging by the sudden look of concern on Brooke's face, the moment he had prepared for was finally beginning. James carefully unfolded the document and placed several pages on the table. Nobody spoke. Even Brooke seemed to understand that interrupting now would be a mistake. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was slowly being replaced by uncertainty. James scanned the first page, then looked toward me. "Helen, before I continue, I want to confirm that you were unaware of the contents of this document." I nodded. "I have never seen it." That was the truth. Richard had never told me exactly what he was planning. Looking back, I understood why. If he had explained everything, I would have tried to stop him. I always believed problems inside a family could be solved with patience and understanding. Richard was the practical one. He believed that character revealed itself when money, property, and power entered the conversation. "Very well," James said. He looked down at the page and began reading. "To whom it may concern. If this document is being opened, it means discussions are taking place regarding my wife's home, living arrangements, or financial independence." Ethan immediately shifted in his chair. Brooke remained motionless, but her eyes never left the document. James continued, "I have spent 43 years married to Helen Carter. No person understands her strength, intelligence, or capabilities better than I do. Therefore, any claim that she is unable to manage her own affairs should be treated with skepticism unless supported by objective medical evidence." Ethan looked toward Brooke. Brooke stared straight ahead. James continued reading. "Furthermore, any effort to pressure, manipulate, or persuade Helen into surrendering her residence against her wishes should be considered contrary to my intentions." The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock behind me. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, from missing Richard. Even after all these months, hearing his words felt like hearing his voice. "This is highly unusual," Brooke said suddenly. "Richard is simply expressing personal opinions." James raised an eyebrow. "I have not reached the legal portion yet." Brooke immediately fell silent. Ethan swallowed hard. James turned another page. "In addition, I instructed my attorney to conduct periodic reviews of all estate documents during my final year of life." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" James looked directly at him. "It means your father requested ongoing revisions." "Revisions to what?" Ethan asked. "To everything." The answer seemed to hit him harder than he expected. For the first time all afternoon, he looked genuinely concerned. Brooke leaned forward. "I do not understand why nobody was informed." James calmly folded his hands. "Because your father specifically requested confidentiality." I remembered those final months again. Richard spending extra time on phone calls. Occasional meetings he described as routine legal housekeeping. I never questioned him. After 43 years of marriage, trust becomes second nature. Now every small memory was taking on a different meaning. James opened another page. "There is also a personal statement." His voice softened slightly. "I believe it should be read exactly as written." He adjusted the paper and continued. "Helen, if you are hearing this, then people may be trying to convince you that your best years are behind you. They are wrong. They may tell you that dependence is inevitable. They are wrong about that too. Never allow grief to become permission for others to take control of your life." My eyes stung slightly. Across the table, Ethan lowered his gaze. Brooke remained perfectly still. "I know my wife," James continued reading. "I know her judgment. I know her values. And I know that she deserves the freedom to make her own decisions without pressure from anyone, including family." The word family seemed to linger in the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then James turned to the final page. "The remainder of this document contains instructions regarding estate protections activated under specific circumstances." Brooke's composure cracked for the briefest moment. "Protections?" she repeated. James nodded once. "Yes." Ethan leaned forward. "What kind of protections?" James placed the page flat on the table and looked directly at both of them. "The kind your father hoped would never be necessary." A silence followed that felt endless. Brooke's earlier confidence was completely gone now. Ethan looked pale, and sitting there quietly, I realized something important. This meeting was no longer about convincing me to leave my home. It was becoming something entirely different. Something Richard had anticipated months before any of us understood why. Then James took a slow breath and reached for the final attachment. "Before I explain the protections," he said, "there is one more document your husband instructed me to present." James reached into the folder and removed a second envelope, smaller than the first and marked with Richard's handwriting. The sight of it made my chest tighten again. I had seen that handwriting thousands of times over 4 decades. Birthday cards, grocery lists, notes left on the kitchen counter. Even now, 6 months after losing him, seeing those familiar letters felt like hearing his voice across a crowded room. "This document is separate from the estate instructions," James said. Richard requested that it be presented only after the first statement was read. Ethan shifted uneasily. Brooke remained silent, but the confidence that had defined her all afternoon was gone. James carefully opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. "This is not a legal document," he explained. "It is a personal record written by Richard Carter." The room fell silent once again. James began reading. "During the final year of my life, I noticed changes within my family that troubled me. At first, I believed I was imagining them. Then I realized I was not." Ethan looked down at the table. Brooke stared straight ahead. "I began observing conversations more carefully. I paid attention to who spoke when Helen was present and who spoke when she was not. I paid attention to decisions being made around her rather than with her. I felt a chill move through me. Suddenly memories began resurfacing. Small moments I had dismissed at the time. Family dinners where conversations stopped when I entered the room. Financial discussions that somehow never included me. Plans announced after they had already been finalized. At the time I assumed everyone was trying to protect me during Richard's illness. Now I was not so sure." James continued. "The most revealing moments were not acts of hostility. They were acts of assumption. People began assuming Helen would eventually surrender control of her affairs. They began assuming her opinions mattered less. They began assuming grief would make her dependent." Brooke finally spoke. "This is unfair." James looked at her calmly. "Would you like me to stop reading?" Brooke opened her mouth, then closed it again. James returned to the letter. "If you are hearing these words, it means my concerns were justified. I hoped they would not be." I felt my hands tighten slightly in my lap. Richard had carried these concerns alone. He had seen things I missed, or perhaps things I refused to see. For most of my life, I believed that good intentions could solve almost anything. Richard believed actions mattered more than intentions. Looking around the conference room, I realized he may have been right. "I love my son," James read. Nothing written here should be interpreted otherwise. However, love does not eliminate accountability. Sometimes it requires it. Ethan lowered his head further. The attorney paused before continuing. "If Ethan is present during this meeting, I hope he listens carefully. The easiest way to lose yourself is to allow others to make your decisions for you." The words landed heavily in the room. For the first time, Brooke looked genuinely uncomfortable. She glanced toward Ethan, perhaps expecting him to object. He said nothing. James continued reading. "Helen spent decades putting this family first. She deserves respect not because of her age, not because of her sacrifices, but because she is fully capable of determining her own future." I felt tears threatening to form, but I blinked them away. Richard was gone. Nothing could change that. Yet somehow he was still protecting me, still standing beside me, still refusing to let others define who I was. "There is one final observation," James said as he reached the bottom of the page. Richard wrote this less than 2 months before his passing. He cleared his throat and read the final paragraph. "If anyone attempts to persuade Helen that her independence is a burden, remember this. The burden is not her independence. The burden is the discomfort some people feel when they cannot control another person's choices." Nobody spoke after that. The silence seemed to stretch endlessly across the room. Brooke stared at the table. Ethan looked exhausted. James carefully folded the letter and placed it aside. Then he opened another folder. Unlike the previous documents, this one was thick, much thicker. Several tabs divided the contents into separate sections. Legal documents, financial records, estate amendments. I immediately understood why Richard had seemed so calm during those final months. He had not been hoping for the best. He had been preparing for the worst. James rested his hand on the folder and looked directly at Ethan and Brooke. "Everything we have discussed so far explains why Richard acted," he said quietly. "What comes next explains what he actually did." James opened the thick folder and slowly arranged several documents across the conference table. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody seemed eager to speak anymore. The confidence that had filled the room at the beginning of the meeting had completely disappeared. Even Brooke looked uncertain now. For the first time that afternoon, she was no longer controlling the conversation. James adjusted his glasses and looked down at the first document. 48 days before his passing, Richard Carter established a series of protective provisions connected to his estate. Ethan frowned. Protective provisions? James nodded. Yes. He turned another page. These provisions were designed to activate if specific conditions occurred after his death. I noticed Brooke sit up straighter. Her attention sharpened immediately. What conditions? She asked. James glanced at her. Any attempt to transfer, sell, refinance, or otherwise alter ownership of Helen Carter's primary residence without her direct written approval. The room became silent again. Brooke exchanged a quick look with Ethan. It happened so fast that most people might not have noticed it. I noticed. Richard would have noticed too. James continued. In addition, these protections activate if any individual attempts to persuade Helen Carter to permanently relocate from her residence against her stated wishes. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Dad actually put that in writing? Yes, James replied. Multiple times. I could feel my heart beating steadily now. Earlier, I had been nervous. Now I felt something different. Clarity. For months I had questioned myself. Wondered whether I was being overly sensitive. Wondered whether grief was affecting my judgment. Listening to Richard's words erased those doubts. He had seen the same things I was seeing. Perhaps even earlier than I had. James opened another section of the folder. There is also a trust amendment. Brooke immediately leaned forward. What kind of amendment? James looked at the page before answering. One that changes how certain assets are distributed. Ethan straightened in his chair. What assets? James remained calm. The residence, several investment accounts, and a family trust established approximately 12 years ago. For the first time, genuine alarm appeared on Brooke's face. She quickly tried to hide it, but it was there. I thought everything had already been finalized, she said carefully. James gave a slight shake of his head. Apparently not. I remembered the final autumn Richard and I spent together. One afternoon, he sat quietly on our porch swing watching leaves drift across the backyard. I asked him what he was thinking about. He smiled and said, sometimes protecting people requires preparation. At the time, I assumed he was talking about retirement planning. Looking back, I realized he meant much more than that. James continued reviewing the documents. Richard included a review clause. Ethan looked confused. What does that mean? It means that if concerns regarding undue influence ever emerged, certain inheritances could be delayed pending independent review. Brooke spoke immediately. Undue influence? Her voice sounded sharper than before. That sounds ridiculous. James remained completely professional. I am simply reading the documents your father signed. Ethan stared at the table. Delayed for how long? James turned another page. Potentially several years. Nobody said anything after that. Outside the conference room windows, clouds had begun moving across the afternoon sky. The sunlight that had filled the room earlier was fading. Everything felt quieter now. Heavier. James carefully organized another stack of papers. There is one detail I should clarify. Brooke folded her arms. What detail? Richard did not create these provisions based on a single event. James paused. According to his notes, they were created after months of observation. The words seemed to land heavily on everyone. Months of observation. Not a misunderstanding. Not a misunderstanding caused by grief. Not a random decision. Months. Richard had been paying attention for a long time. Ethan finally spoke. Dad actually wrote notes? James nodded once. Extensive notes. Brooke looked away. Her expression had become difficult to read. But I could see frustration growing beneath the surface. She was used to controlling situations. Used to knowing what came next. Today, she clearly did not. James closed one folder and opened another. There is one final provision connected to all of this. Ethan looked exhausted. What now? James rested his hand on the final document. If the protections were ever triggered, I was instructed to conduct a full review before any distribution of certain assets could proceed. Brooke's eyes widened slightly. A full review of what? James looked directly at her. Everything. The room fell silent once more. Then James slowly slid a thick sealed packet onto the table. Unlike the previous documents, this one was marked with a bright red label. Confidential. To be opened only if protections are activated. My breath caught in my throat. Because for the first time that afternoon, even James Whittaker looked serious. Very serious. No one reached for the sealed packet. No one even seemed willing to look directly at it. The bright red label sitting on the conference table had changed the atmosphere completely. Earlier, Brooke had spoken with confidence. Ethan had spoken with certainty. Now both of them appeared cautious, as if they had suddenly realized there were pieces of this story they had never been allowed to see. James rested his hands on the table and looked at each of us before speaking. Before I open this packet, I need to make something very clear. His voice remained calm and professional. The protections described in Richard's estate documents have already been activated. Brooke sat upright. Activated by what? She asked immediately. James opened a folder beside him. By documented attempts to discuss the transfer of Helen Carter's residence without her prior approval. Ethan looked stunned. What are you talking about? James slid several pages across the table. Over the past 4 months, my office received multiple communications regarding the future of the property. Ethan glanced at the papers. Brooke did not. Communications from who? Ethan asked. James looked directly at him. Some came from you. Ethan froze. What? Others came from representatives acting on your behalf. The color slowly drained from Ethan's face. I watched him search his memory. Then understanding appeared in his eyes. Not complete understanding. Just enough. The realtor, he said quietly. James nodded once. Yes. Ethan immediately turned toward Brooke. She stared straight ahead. That was just an inquiry, she said. People ask questions all the time. James remained composed. Ordinarily, that would be true. However, Richard's instructions required automatic review if such inquiries occurred before Helen expressed any desire to sell. The silence that followed felt heavy. Brooke folded her arms. So somebody asked a question. That hardly proves anything. James did not argue. Instead, he opened the sealed packet. The sound of the paper breaking seemed louder than it should have. Everyone watched. Even the assistant sitting quietly near the door stopped taking notes. Inside the packet were several documents, each organized in chronological order. James reviewed the first page, then the second, then the third. His expression never changed. That somehow made it worse. Richard anticipated that questions might arise, he said, which is why he requested documentation. Brooke frowned. Documentation of what? James lifted one page. Conversations. Ethan blinked. Conversations? Yes. James placed the page on the table. Notes regarding discussions he personally witnessed during the final year of his life. My heart tightened again. Richard had truly been paying attention, far more than any of us realized. James adjusted the document and began reading. November 12th. Brooke suggested that maintaining the family residence would eventually become difficult for Helen. Recommendation made before any medical concerns existed. Brooke immediately responded. That was a normal conversation. James continued. Reading. January 8th. Discussion regarding future property value and potential sale opportunities. Helen not present. Ethan looked down. Brooke remained silent. James turned another page. March 2nd. Observation that decisions concerning Helen increasingly discussed without direct consultation. I remembered that period clearly. Richard had seemed distracted, thoughtful. At the time I assumed it was related to his health. Now I understood he had been observing something else entirely. James continued. March 27th. Concern that family members may be viewing Helen's future primarily through a financial lens. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Outside the conference room window, rain had started falling against the glass. The city skyline looked darker now, more distant. This is ridiculous, Brooke finally said. These are personal interpretations. James nodded. Some are. Others are supported by additional evidence. Brooke's eyes narrowed. What evidence? James opened another section of the packet. Emails. The single word seemed to echo through the room. Ethan looked confused. Brooke looked alarmed. For the first time all afternoon, genuine alarm. James removed several printed pages and placed them on the table. Copies were provided to Richard by authorized parties prior to his passing. Brooke leaned forward. What emails? Her voice sounded different now. Less confident. Less controlled. James looked at the first page. Then he slowly removed a paperclip holding several documents together. Emails discussing timelines. Nobody spoke. Timelines for what? Ethan asked quietly. James met his eyes. Then he lowered his gaze to the document in front of him. According to these records, he said, timelines regarding when Helen Carter might be persuaded to leave her home. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Ethan stared at James as though he had misheard him. Brooke remained perfectly still, but I could see tension spreading across her face. The confidence she had carried into the meeting was gone now. In its place was something else. Worry. James calmly arranged the printed emails in front of him. To be clear, he said, these documents do not represent casual conversations. They represent organized discussions regarding future plans for Helen Carter's residence. Ethan slowly shook his head. I do not understand. James lifted the first page. Then perhaps this will help. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. Subject line, long-term housing options. Message sent 11 months ago. He paused briefly. The message discusses estimated timelines for encouraging Helen to consider downsizing after Richard's health declined. Ethan looked stunned. 11 months ago? Brooke immediately spoke. That was not what it sounds like. James looked at her. Then what was it? Brooke hesitated. For the first time all afternoon, she did not have an immediate answer. James continued reading. The message references future conversations regarding property value, expected maintenance costs, and relocation strategies. The word strategies seemed to settle heavily across the room. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Months earlier, hearing these words would have devastated me. Now they simply confirmed what Richard had already understood. He had seen the pattern before I did. He had recognized the direction things were moving. James placed the first email aside and lifted another. This message was sent 7 months ago. He scanned the page. The discussion includes estimated market value projections and potential benefits of an early sale. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Who wrote these? James looked directly at him. Several parties participated in the correspondence. Brooke folded her arms. This is ridiculous. People discuss possibilities all the time. James nodded. They do. Then he placed another page on the table. What they do not typically discuss is how quickly a homeowner might become more cooperative after experiencing major personal loss. Nobody spoke. My heart tightened. Even Ethan looked disturbed by that statement. Brooke immediately responded. That is being taken completely out of context. James remained calm. Then please explain the context. Brooke opened her mouth, then closed it again. Across the table, Ethan looked at her. Really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time that day. Something had shifted. Earlier he seemed certain. Now he seemed confused. Uncertain. Uncomfortable. James continued. Richard reviewed these communications personally. He lifted another document. And after reviewing them, he requested additional protections. Ethan stared at the papers. Dad actually saw all of this. Yes, James replied. Every page. I suddenly remembered an evening nearly a year earlier. Richard had been sitting quietly in his study. A folder rested on his desk. When I asked what he was working on, he smiled and changed the subject. At the time, I thought he was protecting me from stress during his illness. Now I realized he was protecting me from something else entirely. James opened another section of the packet. The review process also uncovered additional notes written by Richard. Brooke sighed. More notes. James ignored the comment and began reading. Observation. Increasing focus on future asset management before any discussion with Helen regarding her own preferences. He turned the page. Observation. Repeated references to efficiency and convenience while minimizing personal autonomy. Another page. Observation. Conversations framed as support but structured around predetermined outcomes. Ethan lowered his eyes. Every sentence seemed to affect him more than the one before. I watched my son carefully. For the first time in months, he no longer appeared defensive. He appeared unsettled. Perhaps he was finally seeing the situation through a different lens. James placed the final note on the table. There is one last entry. The room became completely silent again. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. James looked down at the page and read slowly. If these protections are ever activated, it will not be because I failed to trust my family. It will be because I trusted my wife more. I felt my throat tighten. Across the table, Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Brooke looked away. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then James carefully returned the notes to the folder and reached for a separate document hidden beneath the stack. Unlike the others, this one carried a notarized seal and several legal signatures. James studied it for a moment before looking up. Everything we have discussed explains why Richard created the protections. He paused. What this document explains is what happens now that those protections have been triggered. James placed the notarized document in the center of the table and folded his hands. Nobody spoke. The rain continued sliding down the windows behind him, turning the skyline into a blur of gray and silver. Earlier that afternoon, Brooke had entered the room believing she knew exactly how the meeting would end. Now she sat completely silent. Ethan looked exhausted, and I simply waited. Richard had asked me to wait, so I did. James broke the silence first. This document contains the final stage of Richard Carter's estate protections. Ethan looked up. What does that mean? James glanced down at the page. It means your father created a contingency plan. Brooke frowned. A contingency plan for what? James met her eyes. For the possibility that Helen's independence might be challenged after his passing. Nobody responded. James continued. Under the terms of this agreement, all protected assets immediately transfer into an independent trust structure whenever the protections are triggered. Ethan blinked. Transfer where? Into a trust controlled by an independent fiduciary, James replied. Not by family members. Brooke sat forward. For how long? James looked at the document. 10 years. The answer landed like a stone in still water. Even Ethan looked stunned. 10 years, he repeated. James nodded. During that period, no beneficiary may exercise direct control over the protected assets. Brooke stared at him. You are saying nobody controls them? No, James replied calmly. Helen controls her residence completely. The trust protects everything else. I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Richard had not built a weapon. He had built a shield. Even now, months after his death, he was protecting the life we had spent decades creating together. James turned another page. There is also a letter attached to this provision. My heart tightened again. Another letter. Another piece of Richard. James began. Reading. If this section is being read, then events unfolded exactly as I feared they might. The room fell silent once more. I want everyone present to understand something clearly. This trust was never created to punish anyone. It was created to protect Helen from pressure during a vulnerable season of life. Ethan lowered his eyes. James continued. Grief changes people. Some become weaker. Others become stronger. I believe Helen belongs in the second group. She may not always recognize her own strength, but I have spent 43 years watching it. I swallowed hard. Across the table, Ethan looked away toward the rain-covered windows. The purpose of these protections is not to create conflict. The purpose is to create time. Time for emotions to settle. Time for intentions to reveal themselves. Time for truth to become impossible to ignore. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. James turned to the final page. To my son, if you are present, remember something important. Love is not measured by how much control you gain over another person's future. Love is measured by how much freedom you are willing to preserve. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. His shoulders seemed to sink. To Brooke. I hope I was wrong about my concerns. I sincerely do. If I was wrong, these protections will eventually prove unnecessary. If I was right, they were necessary long before anyone realized it. Brooke stared at the table. Her expression had become impossible to read. For the first time since the meeting began, she offered no explanation, no argument, no carefully crafted response. Only silence. James folded the letter and returned it to the file. Then he looked directly at me. Helen, under the terms of this trust, all decisions regarding your residence remain entirely yours. I nodded slowly. Thank you. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. James continued. Nobody can sell the property. Nobody can transfer ownership. Nobody can make housing decisions on your behalf. The room remained silent. Then Ethan finally spoke. Dad really planned all of this. It was not a question. James nodded once. Yes. Ethan stared at the documents spread across the table. Months of preparation. Notes, reviews, letters, protections. Richard had anticipated everything. And for the first time all afternoon, I realized the meeting was no longer about property, inheritance, or legal documents. It was about accountability. It was about facing truths that could no longer be ignored. Then James reached into the folder one final time and removed a small flash drive. He placed it gently on the table and looked at all of us. There is one final item Richard instructed me to present if the protections were ever activated. James picked up the flash drive and connected it to a small monitor mounted on the conference room wall. Nobody spoke. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass while the screen flickered to life. A moment later, Richard appeared. He was sitting on our back porch, wearing the blue sweater he always wore on cool evenings. Behind him, I recognized the maple tree we planted together 20 years earlier. For a second, it felt as though time had folded in on itself. My breath caught in my throat. Ethan stared at the screen. Brooke sat motionless. Richard smiled gently. "Hello, everyone." His voice filled the room. "If you are watching this, then a situation has occurred that required my attorney to activate certain protections." He paused and looked directly into the camera. "Before anything else, Helen, I love you." Tears gathered in my eyes. Not because of the legal documents. Not because of the trust. Simply because I could hear him again. Richard continued. "You spent decades putting other people first. You supported my dreams. You supported our son. You carried this family through difficult seasons without asking for recognition. I hope you remember that your value does not disappear because you grow older." Nobody moved. The room seemed frozen around his words. "Ethan," Richard said, turning serious. "If you are sitting in that room, listen carefully. The day you stop seeing your mother as a person and start seeing her as a responsibility is the day you lose sight of who she truly is." Ethan lowered his head. Richard continued. "Your mother is not an obstacle. She is not a problem to solve. She is not a project to manage. She is the reason you had opportunities one never had." Silence followed. Then Richard smiled slightly. "I am not asking you to be perfect. I am asking you to be grateful." Ethan wiped at his eyes and looked away. Then Richard addressed Brooke. His tone remained calm. Respectful. "Brooke, I genuinely hope my concerns were misplaced. I hope your intentions were always honorable. If that is true, time will prove it. If not, time will reveal that too." Brooke stared at the table. She said nothing. Richard leaned back slightly. "The purpose of these protections was never revenge. I do not believe in revenge. The purpose was clarity. Sometimes people need distance from money and property before they can remember what actually matters." I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Richard had understood something important. Winning was never the goal. Protecting what mattered was. On the screen, he smiled one final time. "Helen, if you are watching this, then you already know what I am going to say next." A small laugh escaped my lips. Even after all these years, he could still surprise me. "Stop doubting yourself," he said. "You are stronger than you think. Stay in the house as long as you want. Plant flowers in the backyard. Drink coffee on the porch. Live your life. Do not let anyone convince you that your story is finished." The video ended. The screen went dark. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then James quietly disconnected the flash drive. The meeting was over. Not officially, not legally, but emotionally, it was finished. The truth had been laid out for everyone to see. Ethan finally turned toward me. His eyes were red. "Mom," he said softly, "I am sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. I saw regret there. Genuine regret. Perhaps not enough to erase everything, but enough to begin understanding. I nodded once. "I know." That was all I said. Brooke remained silent. There was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to explain away. The documents spoke for themselves. Richard spoke for himself. And the consequences belonged to everyone who had helped create them. I stood slowly and picked up my purse. The same purse I had carried into the meeting hours earlier. Yet somehow I felt lighter now. Not because I had won anything, but because I no longer questioned what was real. James stood and offered a respectful nod. I thanked him. Then I walked toward the door. Behind me, nobody smiled. Not Ethan. Not Brooke. Not even the attorney. I remembered the confidence they had carried into that room. The certainty. The quiet assumptions. They had smiled through the entire meeting. Until the end. I stepped into the hallway and headed toward the elevator. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. For the first time in months, the future felt entirely my own.